That was pretty incredible. Throughout time, we've been looking at ways in which machines can improve and change our lives. I'm Dr. Rich Besser from ABC News, and tonight we're going to be looking at the ways that people have tried to use machines to improve the function of our brains. We have with us on the panel some of the leading experts in this field. To get us started and to set the stage, what I want to do is go back over some history. First, looking at the ways people have used electricity to change and understand some of our basic human functions, to some of the more recent efforts to try and use electricity to enhance our brains. Around the same time that Benjamin Franklin was conducting his groundbreaking experiments, Italian physician, physicist, and philosopher Luigi Galvani, he was making some discoveries of his own. When he zapped the muscles in a dead frog's leg with an electric spark, they twitched. And he called this discovery animal electricity. Well, in 1803, a public demonstration of his work was done with the corpse of an executed criminal. And a local writer described it this way. I hope there's no children in the audience. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted. One eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. Writers like Mary Shelley found Galvani's work inspiring, and we found it frightening. Half a century later, Guillaume Duchenne explored the neural pathways of live patients. To understand how the muscles in the human face produce expression, he used electrical probes to create grotesque-looking spasms, which he recorded with the recently invented camera. But perhaps the most publicized form of electrical stimulation is electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, in which patients are treated with an electrical current that induces a full seizure, a grand mal seizure. This was developed in the 1940s, and it was widely used to treat depression until antidepressants revolutionized the approach to mental illness. Pills for depression were in. Electrical stimulation for most patients with depression was out. Drug treatment wasn't limited, however, to treating mental illness. Yes, drugs were developed to fight depression and to fight anxiety, but there were also drugs that were looking at enhancing performance, making us stronger and faster. Even drugs to enhance our performance, yes, and drugs to enhance our performance in the bedroom. On campuses, drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, and modafinil have become favorites of some college students who've looked for that cognitive edge. But today, we're not going to be talking about drugs. We're going to be talking about zapping the brain. And zapping the brain is having a comeback. Unlike electric shock of the past, the new technology sends mild electrical or magnetic current directly into specific areas of the brain. In labs around the world, researchers are exploring use of brain stimulation with brain disorders including stroke and depression, but also in brains that are not suffering from disorders. The military is using it on normal brains to increase vigilance in those people who are operating drones. But this is a barely regulated technology. In fact, you can go on the web. I went on the web this afternoon to this website, Focus, and it's a favorite among gamers. And a number of the interns in the office went to the site too and were blown away that you can go online and you can buy a device, put it onto your head, turn on the current, and play your video games without regulation. There's very little regulation here. Right now, it's basically the wild, wild west. So the question, how effective is this technology? Are there any side effects? Is there any downside to doing this? Is brain enhancement even ethical? The use of any kind of brain enhancement, whether it's pills or zapping the brain, brings up myriad ethical and moral issues, and we're going to be exploring those. But let's face it, we enhance our brain function all the time. I start the morning with a cup of coffee. It gets me going. Some people play music to their developing fetus when they're pregnant. We read to our kids to improve their comprehension and improve their brain function. So where's the line between appropriate brain enhancement and brain enhancement that we think there may be a little something wrong with this? So these are some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with tonight. So I want to go ahead and introduce our distinguished panel. Our first participant is a professor of law and philosophy at Duke University. She is the director of the Duke Science and Society program. In 2010, she was appointed by President Obama to the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues and continues to serve as a member. She's a widely published scholar on the ethical, legal, and social implications of the biosciences and emerging technologies. Please welcome Nita Farahany. Our next participant is Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. He's also the Associate Editor of the Intelligence Journal and the President-elect of the International Society for Intelligence Research. His main research interest uses neuroimaging to investigate the structural and functional neuroanatomy of higher cognitive processes, especially human intelligence. Please welcome Richard Heyer. And our third panelist tonight, a neuroscientist whose research uses structural and functional neuroimaging to investigate normal memory, epilepsy, mental illness, and cognitive dysfunction. His team developed novel approaches and technologies that combine neuroimaging with trans-cranial direct current stimulation, TDCS, to enhance learning and vigilance in civilian and military subjects. Please welcome Michael Weisend. Now, originally we had a fourth panelist, Alvaro Pascual Leone. Due to problems with, I'm not sure which airline or whether I should mention it, he was stuck on the runway for hours and is unable to join us. But the team will cover some of his material during the presentation. First, Richard, I wanted to start with you. We want to try and understand how you can use electricity to alter the brain. Without doing something as drastic as electroconvulsive therapy. And there's this concept of neuroplasticity, and could you take us through this area?
Well, neuroplasticity is just a simple concept that the brain changes. Now, this might not seem like a shocking revelation, but in fact, it was really quite a surprise to researchers who for many years believed the brain was essentially static. We now know that the brain changes its function and its structure, and it's modified by experience, and we can measure these things with brain imaging. And I was able to do a study on this way back in 1992. It was one of the first brain imaging studies of learning. We were interested in what takes place in the brain when a person learns something, and for the something, we decided to study the computer game Tetris. And back in 1992, when we did this, no one had ever heard of Tetris. No one had a personal computer to play at home. So I got a copy of Tetris, and people came to my office every day and practiced for an hour, and we knew they weren't practicing at home because they couldn't. I had one of the rare personal computers at the time, and the idea was to do a brain scan before and after people learn Tetris. Now, if you don't know Tetris, this graphic shows you that individual shapes appear at the top of the screen and slowly fall to the bottom. And as they fall, you use the arrow keys to move them right, left, or bring them down. The object is to complete rows with no gaps. Whenever those rows are complete, you get a point for that row. That row disappears and all the shapes above drop down, changing the configuration. You're watching Danny's mom play. Danny's mom had never played Tetris before, and this is her first game. And you can see the goal in this particular version of Tetris is to see how fast you can complete 40 lines. So you can see the seconds ticking away there on the left, and right below, you can see it looks like she has, from here, about 38 lines to go. She's completed 2. So you all get the idea. And almost everybody knows Tetris. And here's what the brain images look like. When people were naive, that is before they practiced, the first time they played the game, we did a brain image with positron emission tomography or PET scanning, showing where radioactive glucose went in the brain while they were playing. And the red colors in this image show where the brain is most active. And you can see very clearly after 50 days of practice, when the game is faster and harder and clearly more difficult making decisions, in fact, there's less brain activity. And this was an indication that learning makes the brain efficient. And we have spent many years since we published this in 1992 trying to understand what it is about the brain that really is efficient. Then, about 2008, I got a call from the company that owned Tetris, and they had just discovered this 1992 paper, and they said, would you like to try to replicate it? We'll be happy to fund it. And so naturally, I said yes. And in the next slide, you will see the results of our replication study. This was studying adolescent girls who were not interested in computer games. It was harder to find people who didn't know Tetris now, but these adolescent girls really were not gamers at all. And what we found after they trained on Tetris for 3 months was something really unexpected. The blue areas show functional MRI, showing functional brain plasticity. And the blue areas show where the brain was less active after practice. So functionally, the blue areas became less active. The red areas show where there was an increase in gray matter. I had forgot to tell you that this was inspired by a juggling study where structural MRIs had in fact shown that gray matter actually increases in people who had never juggled before. When they learn to juggle and practice for 3 months, there's actually more gray matter in their motor cortex. So we heard about this and we said, geez, I wonder if motor activity, that changes gray matter. What about cognitive activity? Let's reprise the Tetris experiment. And the Tetris company was happy to fund this. So, going back now to the red areas and the blue areas, the red areas are where there was more gray matter after 3 months of practice. And what's really remarkable about this picture is you see there's no overlap between the red areas and the blue areas. We thought the brain would become more efficient in those spots where there was more gray matter. Now, why there's no overlap is a mystery between functional plasticity and structural plasticity. So, now, because of this concept of plasticity, there have been a lot of claims that you can change the brain and make people smarter. You can actually increase intelligence. That experience changes the brain. The brain is plastic, so why not make people smarter? And one of the first examples of this was 1993, when a group published a paper claiming an increase in IQ after listening to a particular piece of music. You recognize this Mozart sonata? Listen to this for a few seconds. Do you feel smarter? Anybody else feel smarter? So this really took the scientific world and the public by storm, that you could become smarter, higher IQ, just by listening to Mozart. At the time, in 1993, the governor of Georgia heard about this and got their state legislature to appropriate money to buy Mozart CDs to give to every mother of a newborn baby in the state of Georgia. So here we are some years later. IQ has not changed. This is now referred to as the Schmozart effect because, in fact, it really couldn't be replicated. But it took years. Every high school science fair I went to when my kids were growing up had a Mozart experiment. And I'm sure these were all over the country. But in truth, it didn't work. But it was an example of brain plasticity. Now, there's another fad that is getting a lot of media attention about training short-term memory, and that is claimed makes your IQ go up. There are now replication studies that show this is not the case, but nonetheless it's still out there in the popular press. This is an example of the short-term memory test that people were trained on for a couple of months. This is a little confusing, so let me explain. Ignore the things moving across the top of the screen and just look at the matrix of 9 cells at the bottom of the screen. Every once in a while, you'll see one of those will light up. You have to remember the position of the cell that lights up. And then the next cell lights up. And when the third cell lights up, if that position was identical to the first one, in other words, 2 back, you press the button. So now when we play it, we're, for demonstration purposes only, showing you the trials across the top. And you can see whenever there are identical trials with one in between, you press the button. Now, this is called the N-back test, where N stands for a number like 1 or 2 or 3. If it's N-back 1, 2 trials that are identical in a row, you press the button. 2 back, there has to be an intervening trial. 3 back, 2 intervening trials. You can imagine what this is like for 4 back or 5 back. And the claim is if you train people to do this so they get 4, 5, or even 6 back, their IQ goes up. The confusion, there are many confusions, but one is that short-term memory is identical with IQ. Short-term memory is important for intelligence, but it's not the same thing. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you in this 2-minute video clip.
The scientists at Japan's Primate Research Institute, the PRI, where Ayumu is based, have devised intelligence tests for chimps. One test is for what's called working memory, the brain's ability to temporarily store and use information. The numbers 1 to 9 are randomly scattered across a touchscreen. The chimp looks at them for as long as is needed to memorize the layout. Then, as soon as 1 is touched, the other numbers are hidden and must now be remembered. We volunteered Chris, the director of this program, to demonstrate this test. He's a college graduate and a crossword addict, but how good is his working memory? When Chris reckons he has memorized the layout, he touches 1. When the others are hidden, he must try to recall 2 to 9 in ascending order.
It takes me ages to remember where they're all placed, and then I think I've got it. It's really very, very difficult.
In 30 attempts, Chris only once reached 9 without making a mistake.
As soon as they're blanked over, it's like my mind's been blanked over as well.
When Ayumu sat the same test, he correctly remembered the numbers almost 90% of the time.
Ayumu gets it right almost every time, and I've got it right once.
Chris fears he's let his species down. But even when the PRI played Ayumu against their best human students who were given regular practice sessions, Ayumu still beat all humans.
So, clearly memory is not the same as intelligence. So I have a challenge for people who make claims about enhancing cognition. I have 2 of them. The first one is, show me enhancing cognition in a human so he can beat that chimp. And the second one is illustrated in the final video I'm going to show you of another person playing Tetris, a world champion. This is not sped up, real time. Remember, the object is to get 40 lines in as little time as possible. It's a real human being. It's not the chimp. So the second challenge is to get Danny's mom to play like this using electrical stimulation or anything else. I would like to see that. So thank you. That's brain plasticity.
Well, we had planned at this point for Dr. Pasquale Leone to present some of his work on using electrical stimulation to try and address the challenge that Richard just gave us. So Richard's going to present some of Alvaro's work now.
Yes, he's done, among others, 2 classic experiments that I know he was going to introduce today. So briefly, I'll just tell you what they are. The first was a brain imaging experiment done in a person who was blind. This person had no vision from birth. And these brain images show this person's brain activation while they did 3 different tasks. These are obviously not visual tasks, but the point is in each of these 3 tasks, it included a memory task and a verbal task. In all of them, you see the visual cortex, the back of the brain, is activated in a person who never used the visual cortex to see. This is a very nice demonstration of functional plasticity, that the visual cortex, when not used for vision, can be used for other things. It takes a little bit of time for the brain to adjust, and that's what's illustrated in the next slide, in the next experiment that he did, with a normal volunteer who stayed blindfolded for weeks. And at the end of only a couple, well, actually it was days. At the end of the second day, that would be some volunteer, wouldn't it? So on the end of the second day, what you can see is the bottom image, right-hand image in the back of the brain. On the bottom there, you see this person's visual cortex is now activated doing non-visual things. So another demonstration that in a person with normal sight, if the brain is deprived of that sight for a relatively short period of time, the cortex changes. And it can be reprogrammed, if you will, to do other things. So I know those are the 2 things he was going to start with.
Michael, one of the things that we want to lay out for people to understand is the different types of stimulation of the brain that are being explored. And so if you could explain to us what the difference is between TDCS and TMS.
Yeah, so the TDCS is one species of electrical brain stimulation. TMS is magnetic brain stimulation. In TDCS and other forms of electrical stimulation, what happens is the brain's an electrical organ. So it makes all kinds of sense. If you want to change it, you can apply electricity to do that. Now, most of us are no strangers to changing our brains. If you had a cup of coffee this morning, or if you had some other drug that helps you deal with some health issue, you're very likely affecting your brain. What we're doing here is trying to affect only the brain and leave your heart and your lungs and your kidneys and your liver to do their jobs, right? So electrical brain stimulation can come in 3 forms. Those 3 forms are a DC current. A DC current ramps up, stays level, and then ramps down at the end of stimulation. AC current puts in a sine wave, or a wave that travels up and down like this. And TRNS, another type of stimulation that's in the literature, puts in a string of random values and changes the electrical activity that's traveling through the brain accordingly. TMS now is a different kind of brain activity, or a different kind of brain stimulation. TMS is delivered as a square wave. Okay, square wave means you're flat, then you come up, you go back down. The square wave, the width of that square wave is typically on the order of milliseconds, or thousandths of a second, right? The electrical brain stimulation methods we've been talking about, what they do is they change the brain's level of activity, or level of excitability, from low to slightly higher. And essentially turn up the gain on the environment is the idea. So that when you see a light, it's a little brighter, or when you see or when you hear a sound, it's a little more salient among all the other stimuli that are in the environment. TMS is different. TMS puts in the square wave, and that directly activates or forces neurons to be active. Okay, so in TMS, you put in a magnetic current, and it influences the underlying electricity, and it depends on how frequently you repeat that square wave in terms of the cognitive effect you get. With low frequencies of repeating the square wave, for example, once per second, you get a decrease in the excitability of the brain, with higher rates, like 10 hertz or 10 stimulations per second, you get an increase in the activity.
Got that? So a lot of the technology we're talking about is really in the early experimental phases, but not all of it. The TMS, the magnetic stimulation you were just hearing about, has already been FDA approved for the treatment of depression. And we want to show you a little video here of the experience of one New York hero in using that treatment.
I guess everybody wants to be a firefighter when they grow up. You want to help people, love doing the job, and thought that I would be doing the job for 30 years or more. When we first got down on the pile, it was a bit overwhelming because it was such a huge mess. Just the amazing amount of destruction that was in front of you. You know, you really got to see the sight, the smell, the taste of the magnitude of the destruction that was there. Things started to go downhill at first, and then things got really bad where I was in a very deep depression. I pulled away from my family and friends. I slept a lot. I was suicidal at a point. There was only one way out of it, and it wasn't good. I worked with the psychiatrist for the fire department. I don't remember how many, but there was probably 8 or 10 different medications that we had tried. At the point where he asked me to retire, he said that he had gone through everything that he had in his playbook, I guess, to try and relieve some of my symptoms. I lost my dream job. I needed to do something to help. I just thought that trying TMS was definitely worth a shot. You sit in the chair, you get the treatment, which feels like somebody tapping on your head really fast. It's just short bursts of the pulses. Within the first 2 weeks, there was a little bit of a change. I started just waking up in the morning before my alarm clock and got up and ready for the day. I was sleeping better at night. I wish the treatment was available to me before I had to retire. I think it would have made a huge impact on how I responded, and I believe that I probably could have stayed on the job and continued being a firefighter.
So although that's approved by the FDA for use, it's really not fully understood how that modality treats depression. We want to shift now to talking about one of the other modalities that Michael talked about, TDCS. And Michael Weisend is an expert in this area. He's been conducting research on this technology, and it's used to increase the vigilance in drone operators. How does that work?
So first, I'd like to say thanks to all the people that watch our backs so that we can sit here in relative safety and comfort and have this conversation. So, and those people need help. They, in the video you saw the effects of missing intelligence signals that were clearly there in the after-action reports, and we need help in doing this better. So we were approached years ago. We applied to and received funding from DARPA to investigate ways in which we could accelerate training to find the signals that people might identify to prevent things like the attacks that occurred on 9/11. One way to do that is to stimulate the brains of people who are looking at these pictures. So when you guys look at pictures, you're only capable of one percept at a time. All right, and that one percept at a time is often shown in lots of visual illusions that you see, and I think we have an example of one here. So how many people see a vase? How many people see two people looking at one another? Can you see them both at the same time? It's very difficult. If you can, you're a special brain. In this case, the brain acts as a winner-take-all system. All right, one visual percept at a time. Now, the people that are examining images to try to find threats are basically playing a game of Where's Waldo? Right? Is there a threat in this image or not? And they may look at a whole book of Where's Waldo, or an image something like this, right? Where you have to find something specific. If I told you in this figure to find, let's see, can I pick something out here? So, does everybody see the deck of cards, or the game cards? How about the Barbie? How about the Dora? Yeah. All right, so now what if I ask you to find the wrecked car? Yeah. So this is a game that our intelligence analysts play all day, every day. And they play it for 12 to 14 hour shifts. Now imagine doing that constantly for 12 to 14 hours. All right, it's a big job, and the thing that you're looking for may not be in the image, right? Okay, so we have some examples of those images, I think, that we are going to show you. This is what's called a target chip. This was one of the training images that we used when we were doing the study. So who knows what that is? That is a Humvee image from about 5 miles away. All right, so now if we go to the next image, we can, now does everybody see the Humvee here? This is one of the easy target images. All right, does everybody see the Humvee here? All right, so if we go to the next image, it will identify the Humvee for you. There it is, up Hemet 310 right there. Okay, so now let's go to a medium image. So this is the medium image. You guys all see the Humvee? All right, so the Humvee, I believe in this one, is over on the left. Oh no, I was wrong. The Humvee is on the right, the missile launcher's on the left. All right, and that's a medium image. Now we have a difficult image. All right, everybody see the Humvee and the missile launcher? All right, but this is what our guys in uniform are doing 12 to 14 hours a day, every day, and then getting off work and going to soccer practice, right? So they need help, all right? If you guys had difficulty doing this, the people who we take out of high school, run through boot camp, do a few schools with, and sit down in front of a computer screen are going to have the same and or greater difficulty. So, what are the results? Does this thing work? Right? So if you look at the green bar, these images show the number of correct identifications of targets divided by the number of false alarms. Okay, so a value of 2.5 here means that you are correct 2.5 more times than you are wrong. The green bar shows training alone. The blue bar shows training plus putting all the gear on your head but not turning it on. It's called sham stimulation. And the red bar shows training plus stimulation. We can dramatically change how good people are at this task after a short amount of training. Okay, so we train, what we did in particular in the studies, we showed them images like you just saw. We showed them the target chips for an hour, and then we embedded those target chips into the city scenes that you saw. And without stimulation, roughly 2.5 to 3 times better after the training. With stimulation, about 7 times better with 1 hour of training on the target chips.
Fascinating. Well, Michael has demonstrated that this technology can work. It can have a positive effect. But there are questions in terms of when should this be used? Who should it be used by? What are the ethical implications of this? And bioethicist Nita Farahany is writing a book on just that subject.
TDCS, as well as other types of electrical stimulation, fit just within a category, a very broad category of ways in which we can enhance our brains. So that's why many of you are here this evening, is to enhance your brains, to learn something about this topic. We go to school, we eat good nutrition, hopefully sometimes, we exercise. All of those things are really designed to improve our health, to improve our mental functioning, to improve our cognitive functioning. So as a baseline, there's nothing wrong and everything right with us as humans trying to improve our cognition. But the question is, when is it appropriate to do so? When you have a new and novel kind of technology, particularly something like TDCS, who should have access to it? If all of you came here this evening and for the first time you're learning about TDCS, should you have in your hands a consumer-based TDCS device that you could apply to your head, then up or amp up what's happening in your brains? Are there any concerns about that? Should there be regulation of it? Should there be instructions or informational guidelines that are given to you? And what's the context in which it's okay or when it's not okay to use it? So, consider this, and we'll start with just, I think, a couple of images to sort of pique people's thinking about these ethical issues. So, how many of you had a cup of coffee or tea at some point today? Most of you. How many of you never drink any form of caffeine or eat any form of caffeine? So no chocolate either? Right. So again, how many of you never consume any form of caffeine? No chocolate, really? All right. I bet we could find some caffeine in your diet somewhere. But in any event, why are we okay with the vast majority of you using a stimulant every day of your life? When did we come as a society to think that that's a permissible form of cognitive enhancement, where this fellow in the front row either doesn't like it or can't tolerate it, or for whatever reason, he's not enhancing his brain the way the rest of you are? When did we come to embrace that as something that was permissible and good to do? And is there any difference between us all having a cup of coffee versus zapping our brains? Is it really just the same thing? Is it all just on a kind of gradient of what we consider to be permissible versus impermissible use? Well, we know at least in one context that we're not okay with certain forms of enhancement, right? So if you pay to go to a sporting event, what you're paying for is seeing natural, honed talent, whatever that might mean, right? It is a person who has some sort of natural gifts, that has worked hard to improve their gifts, and therefore they're a great cyclist as opposed to one who is a doped up cyclist, or they're a great pitcher, or they're a great batter, or they can dunk a basketball. Whatever they can do without taking steroids and without taking drugs and without doing things that artificially enhance. Okay, and we've come to decide that that's what we want to celebrate. Okay, that's what sports are about. Just like we all celebrate baseball and we're not that excited when we discover that our baseball pitchers are actually doping or our baseball batters are doping so the home runs aren't as exciting, we could decide otherwise. As a society, we could come to think, actually, instead of watching baseball, we want to watch schmaceball. And schmaceball is a league in which everybody dopes. Okay, and it turns out all they do is hit home runs. And I bet if we put it out there and you all got to decide, do you want to buy tickets to Schmaseball or do you want to buy tickets to baseball, market forces would help us decide which league should actually exist. And in fact, we have something sort of like that. What's the wrestling, worldwide, whatever that one is? That's not real.
It's not real.
I'm sorry to break it all to you.
We're learning something.
Yeah, it's not real. But nevertheless, people still pay big money to watch those sporting events. Okay, but in that context, we've decided, at least for now, until we have Schmaseball, that we don't want to watch Schmaseball. We want to watch baseball. What about standardized tests? So what are standardized tests? Measuring, I'm not quite sure, but supposedly they are good predictors of how well you're going to do in college or how well you're going to do in second grade or how well you're going to do in law school or any other kind of thing. It's supposed to give us a baseline by which we compare individuals. And as most of you are aware, whether it's in high school or in college or even at younger levels, people are already starting to take drugs like Adderall or other types of drugs like Ritalin, the drugs which are stimulants, before they take the tests in order to prepare or study for that test. Is that cheating? I hear a no. But is that cheating? Think about it for just a minute. In sports, it's cheating because it's artificial enhancement. Is it cheating if it's for a standardized test? Is it cheating if we start applying TDCS while you study for the test? TDCS alone is not going to make you smarter, but it could potentially make you identify targets faster. And maybe those targets are the vocab matching words or logic games or things like that. If you do it while you're learning, it may improve your ability to take certain types of tests. At Duke University, it's the first university in the country that put into its cheating policy taking prescription drugs for which you do not have a prescription for enhancement purposes to improve your performance. I wasn't part of that decision. So I'm not saying that it is a good decision, but certainly one university has put a stake in the ground and said it's cheating to do so. Is it cheating to have TDCS? Is it not? So let's look at the next slide. What this image is helping you with is it's not just a benevolent parent who's helping their child, but it should evoke for you a little bit the conversation that happens in society about tiger parents. Some of you in this audience might be tiger parents. And if you were tiger parents and you had in your hands a TDCS unit and you could apply it to your young child and you had a promise that they would do better on standardized tests, and we're here in New York, so I know that there's this crazy competition to get into schools here in New York. So what if I could tell you that if you apply TDCS to your child while they're taking the standardized test, they're going to do better and get into the preschool that will make sure that they get into the elementary school that will make sure that they get into the college and have a successful career on Wall Street, right? Would you use it? Well, they might, and is that okay? Right, so parents all the time are making decisions for their children that enhance their cognition in particular ways. They're taking them to dance lessons or taking them to music lessons. Maybe they're letting them listen to Mozart or even learn to play Mozart. They are getting them tutors. They are giving them good nutrition. They're encouraging them to exercise. All of these things enhance their brains. But most of those things we understand, at least within a certain parameter, what the risks and benefits are. Now, some of them, we understand the risk may be that you're ensuring that your child's going to spend a lot of years in therapy later in life. But what we might not realize with TDCS is we don't know what the full scope of the risks and benefits are. So if you, looking at the next slide, were to apply TDCS and it increases the activity, the baseline activity in a particular region of the brain, because you're putting it in specific spots. If energy is conserved in some way, which it's supposed to be, does that mean that it's decreasing activation in some other region of your brain? And so what this is showing you right now is the amygdala. The amygdala, at least before a paper came out this week and suggested maybe all of the studies are wrong, supposedly is the area of the brain that's really essential for moral conscience and for emotion. And if you have decreased activation in the amygdala, then, so the theory goes, you are less likely to have moral conscience. You are less likely to be an empathetic individual, less likely to have emotion. So suppose you have a child who you decide you really want to get into that super competitive preschool here in New York City, and you start applying TDCS to them, which leads to decreased activation in a different area of the brain, and it happens to be a decreased area called the amygdala. Are you in fact just producing a little psychopath? Maybe so. Psychopaths, in part, are really smart and lack moral conscience and emotional processing. What's the consequence and risk of doing so? And should parents get to shape the brains of their children in this way? You already shape the brains of your child if you're a parent in many ways. But is this way, this altering the structure and function so directly, one that's ethically permissible? Or should there be regulations or limitations on who or when you use those types of technologies? There are a host of ethical issues that are involved with all of the different cognitive enhancement technologies. One that we're talking about is electrical stimulation, but it doesn't have to be that kind of hard stimulation that we're talking about. There are other devices that are already on the market, just like there are TDCS units that are on the market, that could enable you through neurofeedback to improve your cognition as well. So we're actually going to do a little demonstration, I think, of that, and see, just to have people have a sense of like, what are the devices that are out there? What are the things that you can do to your brain? And I think I need another little help here to make this happen. Excellent, thank you. And I have a willing victim up here, which is great. Since he does these other devices, I thought we could go ahead and just see his brain and see what he's done to his brain with all of the devices that he's been testing in his lab. So what I'm hooking up to him right here is a really simple EEG device, okay, which measures electrical activity in the brain. And this is actually just going to measure through this single electrode right here that is on his forehead. You see that little device right there? And it's grounded over here on his ear. Is that comfortable? Mm-hmm. I bet, yeah. So what we're going to measure is just really simple alpha and beta waves, which correlate to attention and meditation. And we're going to look at how well he can pay attention while all of you are watching. Okay, and so we're going to go to the screen here, and what you're going to see is his brain activity. So what he wants to do is have as much green as possible. And as he gets higher up, if he can, he's going to get a little neurofeedback because you're going to hear the sound. Okay, let's all be very quiet and see if you can pay attention for a minute. That's pretty good, right? We should give him a little round of applause. If he were to continue working with this device for a while, what he would do is be able to get in that green band much more quickly and much more regularly. And what that may correlate with is an increased ability to pay attention in things like school, or watching his Facebook page, or any other activity which might require increased attention and concentration, which is a form of enhancement. And in fact, when they've done studies to see whether or not this in fact changes your brain, it in fact also, just like the images that we saw earlier, changes the gray matter in your brain when you do neurofeedback like this. That's neat. Do you wonder how it is that we got it up there on the screen? Yeah? So real time, you were watching his brain activity. And his brain activity was being recorded through that electrical signal, through the electrode right here, which was a dry electrode, which was communicating to the iPad that they brought out here, which they wouldn't have had to bring out here. They just wanted me to be able to see it and interact with it because the range was long enough to go back there because it was communicating via Bluetooth. And many of your devices communicate via Bluetooth, right? And how secure do you think Bluetooth is? Not particularly secure. And This is not a terribly frightening device because it's not actually applying electrical current. So even though he willingly let me put it onto his brain, I couldn't zap his brain. I could start to see some of the neural signatures that were in his brain. And I could start to see, for example, if he was getting drowsy or if he was paying attention. You all saw him stopping, paying attention. I don't know what he was looking at instead of actually participating in the experiment for us. But imagine now if you're in the workplace and we can require you to wear this all day long. Know how much you're paying attention, how distracted you are. Imagine if your neural signature could help us figure out what your ATM password is. You don't have to imagine too much about these things because they already are true. We're already using neural signatures for passwords to be able to unlock devices. Or there was a study that came out recently that suggested that we could actually figure out a person's ATM password simply through reading EEG information from their brain. And there are companies that are already piloting using devices like this in the workplace to try to measure productivity, and insurance companies who are piloting having truck drivers wear them because the leading cause of accidents in this country is drowsy driving, not drunk driving. That's all wonderful in the potential upside, but there's no protection right now, no legal protection, no constitutional protection, no structure in society that gives you any form of privacy over your neural function. And just like through Bluetooth, I could read his brain activity if he was wearing the device or if I forced him to wear the device as part of his employment. Force is a strong word there. Bluetooth technology governs a lot of the different consumer-based TDCS devices. What happens if somebody hacks into it? What happens if somebody starts zapping your brain? Take the device off. That's the first thing you should do, right? But these are the kinds of questions that we have to start asking. Are there privacy concerns? Are there contexts in which we shouldn't be using it? Is it cheating if you use it in particular contexts like a school study or a school setting? These are all the types of things that I think we need to be talking about more broadly.
You know, Michael, earlier you were talking about TDCS and other ways people try and stimulate their brain. And I think you've all used the analogy of the cup of coffee. Is the electric brain stimulation better than being caffeinated up?
In some tasks, yes. All right, so there was a recent study done by a colleague of mine named Andy McKinley, who's at the Air Force Research Labs, one of the smart, truly bright guys coming up in this field. And what Andy did was he sleep deprived people for 30 hours. And did cognitive testing the whole time, right? So you were talking about, Rich was talking about subjects being blinded. These were also very good subjects, right, that stayed in the lab to do this. After 30 hours of sleep deprivation, they got either brain stimulation, no brain stimulation, or caffeine. People who got brain stimulation were good at tasks that were administered that are, one is called the Mackworth clock test. I don't know if you guys have ever heard or seen of this, but it is the very definition of dull and boring, right? So what this task does is it takes a little dot and it runs it around a screen like this in clock positions, and every once in a while, it skips one. When it does that, you have to press a button every time it skips. People who underwent brain stimulation were good at this task for 6 hours after stimulation. People who got coffee were good for between 30 minutes and 2 hours. And people who got no stimulation went immediately to sleep. Not really, because Andy kept them awake, but they certainly felt like it. Andy did additional tests where caffeine and brain stimulation had roughly similar effects. So when we're talking about the magnitude of the effect here, and Nita and I were talking about this backstage earlier, is that I can't download information into your brain using this thing yet. But what I can do is I can push your natural abilities. I can tell you one thing that we're doing right now that has a way bigger effect than TDCS, and that is speaking to you. So if I told you the scallops are really good, or I measured your brain activity, looked at the difference between eating scallops and eating steak, placed it on your head, and then stimulated to try to push your preference toward scallops, I'd still be more successful with speech.
Fascinating. Did you have a device with you?
Yes, I do. Well, I have the electrodes with
Yeah.
me. So it's a very simple device, and the electrodes are super important because right now we have a ton of data that tells us about how good these things are cognitively, but you really have to take care of the skin. So it's a very simple device, right? This has electrodes on the inside, right? And then on the outside, here are the holders. This holder's flexible, can put it in any conformation you might want. We simply chose this pentagonal arrangement because it mimics what most other people do by putting the electrode in one spot. And so you simply take this thing and you put it on different spots in the head to influence different kinds of behavior, right? So this is one of the things that's super critical for applying this, right? Is that different spots in the head do different things. So if you want to change function A, you'd have electrode configuration A. If you want to do configuration B, you'd have electrode configuration B. So what you see here is you see somebody actually performing these target identification tasks with the electrodes on their head. And this is Jess Kane, who's in my lab. She told me to tell you she's awesome. She really did tell me that, to tell you that. If her picture went up on the screen here, it's kind of funny. But anyway, Jess is performing this task. What she's doing there is all the red circles that you see, where the red and the yellow overlap, those are correct choices. And where there's yellow alone, those are misidentifications. And where there's red alone, she's identified something as a target when it's really not. All right, so we give the subjects immediate feedback as they're going through the task as part of the training.
Now, before everyone in the audience rushes out to get their electrodes and their battery, you have some safety concerns here.
I have big safety concerns here, and I'll tell you mostly why. What we have is we have a whole bunch of data on tolerability, but not a lot of data on safety. Okay, and there's a subtle but important difference. Tolerability means we can apply this to people, and at the end of the day, they're still a walkie-talkie. They get up from their chair, they walk away, and they continue to talk normally, right? That's what we know. There is not one single study out there who has taken electrical brain stimulation, done a whole bunch of good neuroimaging before stimulation, applied the stimulation, done some more neuroimaging, applied some more stimulation, done some more neuroimaging, and said, thumbs up, there are no detrimental changes to the brain that we see, right? That study does not exist. And so we need to do that kind of work before we can say it's both safe or before it's tolerable and safe. Right now we have a lot of data on tolerability, not safety.
Although, do we ever do that with drugs? I mean, do we ever get that kind of like no detrimental effects anywhere in the brain, you know, for really anything? We don't get that kind of like, here's the baseline before anybody ever took it, to, you know, lots and lots of applications, here's afterwards. It seems like a slightly higher level of expectation of safety than we have with existing devices and existing drugs that are on the marketplace. Well,
I can tell you what I think is normal, and that's the standard I'd like to see. And I it's a standard that I kind of live by, right? Because I test every device I've ever used on me before I put it on another human being. And I have the scars to prove you can be dumb about how you apply this, because I have burned my forearm up and down by applying these electrodes in a bad way. Oh, and you can see this here. This is a series of electrodes that we tested as we were going through to develop the one that I showed you a minute ago, and afterwards, if you want to see it, you can come up and look at it. So on the left are conventional sponge electrodes applied to my forearm right here. All right? And what you can see at the end, and it's not super clear, but I hope you can see this, is there are raised areas and there's redness, and that's on the scalp, and it's hidden by hair most of the time. When it's not hidden by hair, you can see this on people's foreheads. All right, so we tried some different kind of electrodes, also cause plenty of redness. In the third column, where you see the electrode that's part round and part square, bottom row, you can see a spot on my skin there that is discolored. It's brown, right? Well, that, when they wiped the conductive paste off of my arm, that plug of tissue about the size of a dime wiped away, and it had kind of the consistency of snot. All right? So you can do that, and so I had a dime-sized hole in my arm for a couple of weeks, and people kept telling me I should bandage it, and I kept saying, I can see my muscles move down there. It's kind of cool. All right?
Yeah.
So, and then we went through a whole series of other electrodes until we got to the ones that we use in the lab now and are used by the Air Force as well, that the most mark they leave is the pressure mark from the rings, right? Almost no redness, almost no sensation, and I can tell you all about them in incredibly boring detail, but basically, we spent a lot of money and time trying to make sure that we could, at first principles, care for the skin so that we could deliver this to the brain.
A question for you all. So if you learn a function while using one of these stimulation methods, when you no longer have that current going on, are you still able to perform at the enhanced level? Richard, do you want to?
I think most of these techniques, I don't do this kind of research myself because before I'm retired now, this stuff came along after I retired.
Yeah.
If I wasn't retired, I probably would be working on this. But it's my understanding that the stimulation often occurs before the task is done. Kind of warm up the brain in a sense, isn't that right?
Well, there's two kinds of stimulation.
Yeah.
Right? So one is called online stimulation. Online stimulation means that the training and the task are simultaneous. There's offline stimulation. Offline stimulation means that you precede the task with stimulation. Okay, and there's two different ideas there. So you can feel this, right? You can feel it on your skin, the electrical stimulation. So there's a problem there scientifically, and that is that if you know it's on, the placebo effect is at maximum overdrive, and so you may do better just because there's somebody that's doing something uncomfortable to your skin and it's preventing you from falling asleep during these boring tasks, right? So what we do is a sham procedure where we ramp up the current and ramp it back down. We make sure the subject's blind. We make sure the blind in this case doesn't mean putting something over your eyes. Blind in this case means ignorant. All right, so that they don't know what stimulation condition they're receiving, either active or sham. Blind. We also run the electrode connectors through a box that has wiring in it that's obscured by an opaque lid, an opaque box with an opaque lid, so that the person plugging in the machine doesn't know if electricity is actually moving through the box and into the subject. So we double blind everything in this way. We also do within subject studies. Within subject studies means that the same person who gets sham treatment gets active treatment, and we cross them over so that the order is randomized. When we do that, if you learn something during stimulation, the memory is a memory like every other memory, and it sticks with you. All right? If we took the tasks that Dr. Heyer showed us earlier with the two-back, remembering the position of the lighted blocks in the tic-tac-toe diagram, you're not there trying to teach somebody something. What you're trying to do there is enhance something called working memory that I often call pizza memory, right? So pizza memory is basically in the days when there were phone books, which I remember, right? You would look up the number in the phone book, you'd repeat it to yourself while you walked over to the phone, and then, date myself again, you would dial the phone, and hopefully you could remember the number, and if that number, if you ordered pizza every day, you'd remember the number. If you ordered pizza once a month, you wouldn't remember the number, and you have to hold it in memory, and that's part of the working memory. We can enhance working memory during stimulation or with stimulation that precedes the task, and afterwards you go right back to baseline.
So let me just raise one issue.
Okay, go short, because then I want to get to some of these questions.
I'll be very quick, which is just to take that and consider if your physician did well in medical school and passed the medical boards via TDCS or some other form of enhancement, and then stopped doing that once they passed the boards and were your physician, would you be psyched about going to that person, and would you think that they were misrepresenting what their actual medical training was? And this is one of the issues that's actually happening, is people are using these forms of enhancement while they're in school, and then they get out of school, they're no longer using it. Maybe they have things in working memory, but their skills and their abilities may not actually be fairly represented by the types of degrees and accomplishments that they have behind their name. So kind of ethical conundrum that arises from your question.
Does that also hold for chemical stimulants, things that improve focus?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, chemical stimulants are what are much more common today. And caffeine, of course, being the one that we're the most comfortable with, but lots of drugs like Ritalin, Adderall, modafinil that people are using today are things people are using temporarily while they're in a kind of competitive stage of life. Then they get to the next stage of life, and we think and rely upon those different types of credentials, which might not actually represent their skills or abilities.
So you gave an incredible demonstration there about privacy issues around this and the lack of regulation that's going on. But this is not a drug. There are applications we were talking about in the medical field, but when you're talking about performance, where would you see regulations coming from? What part of government might be responsible for regulating this?
Well, the Food and Drug Administration is in fact looking at these devices to consider whether or not to regulate them. Whether it falls within the Food and Drug Administration's purview depends on whether or not they are classified as medical devices. That's why the company that you were noticing earlier with the slide Focus, FO.CUS Focus, they are sort of trying to stay under the radar by claiming that they're for gaming purposes rather than for enhancement purposes. And if they're gaming purposes, then they're not a medical device because they're not intended for the use of diagnosis or treatment of a disease. Once the FDA says, hey, that's a sham game that isn't going to work with us, and that's actually a medical device, it could fall within their purview, and then it would be part of what they would actually regulate.
I just want to add that if you are undergoing surgery, you might want your surgeon to be wearing one of these devices. And if they're not, if there's research that shows they can perform better, if your surgeon chooses not to do that, and there's a mistake, is he guilty of malpractice for not putting that on?
So that leads to this question
Not yet.
It'd
have to be the standard of care.
Right, question from Dom Cobb to all of you. What is your prediction for where these technologies will take us 50 years from now? Is that where it's going to take us?
I have kind of this secret fantasy that I'll be transported 50 years into the future to see how this all comes out. Wouldn't that be great? Because we could be completely wrong about this. 50 years from now, it could be very common as a cup of coffee. I don't think these things can be banned. It's like banning alcohol.
And I don't think they
Doesn't work.
should be banned. I think we should just, we need to deliberate about what the appropriate context, use, and, if regulation is to ensure that they're safe, that they're effective, that we get the kind of information we need to understand if you apply it, that you may end up with, being able to see your muscles without intending to do so, right? So.
But, if it really works, and it really works to a noticeable degree, then parents are going to demand the right to give this technology to their children. They're going to demand it.
It's just such a trickier area because giving it to your child is not the same as influencing and shaping their brain in ways that we were never able to do before. Now, that's what all new technology does, but it's a little harder when you're talking about the relationship between parent and child versus a consenting adult who has the competency, capacity to make decisions for themselves and to be self-directed about what they choose to do, as opposed to a parent making a potential little psychopath.
Here's a question from Natalia, who is in the offsite audience in Manila, in the Philippines. Can any of these treatments improve focus for people with ADHD? Is research going?
So there's actually been some research on these devices, these EEG devices. Some of the studies suggest that doing neurofeedback, playing, games, attentional games with these, may be more effective than using drugs like Adderall and Ritalin. That in fact, neurofeedback changes your brain and can change your brain permanently as well. So there is some in that. And TDCS, I know that there's been some ADHD studies as well. If you want to,
there's three. Right now there are three studies that show positive results, and there's a clinical trial going on for ADHD at NIH that's funded by NIH. So I don't believe it's done yet, but we'll know the results of that in the next couple of years for sure.
So Bob Yaffe wants to know about adverse effects over the long run for TMS and TDCS, and I'll ask you specifically, Michael. You're using this in the military. Are there concerns that what is giving a positive benefit right now in terms of identifying targets may have a long-term effect on those people's brains?
So I think there's a couple of ideas mixed up in that, right? So I think TDCS, TMS, what have you, in terms of brain stimulation, is going to be a lot like going to the gym. Meaning that if you go once and do the training once, you'll reap the benefits of going once. Nobody wants to get the benefits of going to the gym once, right? What that is sore muscles for a few days. So we're going to have to think about this in exactly the terms that are suggested by the person asking this question. What are the effects of repeated administration over long periods of time? Right now, we don't have any good data on that. What we know for a fact is that skin, you can't keep delivering it to the same piece of skin over and over and over, which is problematic, because if you move the electrode, you change the piece of brain that's being stimulated. And so I think there's going to be a lot of work and a lot of progress is going to need to be made on the electrode skin interface before we can do a good job of learning, even approaching the problem of what's it like for long-term intervention.
And is there concern that the stimulation of one part of the brain will have untoward consequences in another part of the brain?
There's no question. The brain is not simple. It's not that one spot on the brain does one thing and a different spot does something else. A lot of people think this is the way the brain works. But in fact, even for the most simple task, areas all over the brain are orchestrated. So if I tell you press a button when the light comes on, and I do a brain image with a technology that shows me what's happening in your brain millisecond by millisecond, in the half second it takes you to press the button, you will see all areas of the brain are lighting up. It's really quite phenomenal. The brain is not simple.
When people ask me this question, I ask them, where is right turn in a car? Is it in the hands? Is it in the brain? Is it in the wheels? Is it in the steering linkage? Where is it? Right turn is the group of things working together. And so by analogy, if you put better tires on the car, that might be what TDCS is. If you put a better steering wheel or better linkage, that might be what TDCS helps. But you can help any way along that path where you decide to stimulate.
Right, but just because you're helping, right? I mean, so you might improve your steering wheel, but if the steering wheel comes at the cost of the brake pedal,
Yep.
right, that's a problem.
Amen.
Right, and so I think the question
So,
is
I mean,
really,
one of
do
the
you lose
issues
the
in-
brakes
right.
if you have a great new steering wheel? And maybe, we don't know.
We don't
That's one of the questions that we don't know, and that's one of the frightening parts of it is repeated stimulation may improve one function in the brain. It may come at the cost of decreased activation in another region of the brain. It is all integrated, which means you may have much broader impacts all over, the brain, meaning distributed functions are going to be impacted, or it could be a specific skill set or specific type of thing like emotion is very significantly impacted while you're improving a particular type of cognition.
We'll get some hints when gamers using these things show up at the emergency room.
That's true.
Or in jail. Right.
Well, on that pleasant note, we are just about out of time, and I want to thank our three panelists for what I found to be a really stimulating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.